Imagine a ship carrying 376 passengers, men, women, and children, arriving on Canadian shores after weeks at sea. These passengers were not just immigrants, they were British subjects, citizens of the empire that Canada belonged to in 1914. Yet, instead of a welcome, they were met with hostility, fear, and racism. This is the story of the Komagata Maru, a powerful chapter in Canada's history of exclusion, and an even more powerful example of resistance. The Komagata Maru incident demonstrates how marginalized communities resisted Canada's exclusionary immigration policies, challenging systemic racism and asserting their rights in the face of oppression. This matters for understanding Canada because it highlights the country's historical struggles with racism and exclusion, while also demonstrating the power of collective action to challenge injustice and inspire future movements for equality. Today, we will be exploring how the Komagata Maru incident demonstrates resistance against systemic racism in Canada. We will dive into how the passengers and their allies fought back against deeply entrenched discrimination. They refused to accept oppressive cultural norms and left a legacy of resilience in the face of injustice. At the turn of the 20th century, Canada's immigration policies were designed to keep out certain groups of people. While European immigrants were encouraged, others, especially those from Asia, faced systemic barriers. By 1908, the Canadian government introduced a continuous journey regulation, requiring immigrants to travel directly from their country of origin to Canada without stopping elsewhere. This policy effectively barred immigration from India, as no direct routes existed at the time. The head tax on Asian immigrants was already $200. This was a massive sum at the time, but this wasn't enough for those in power who wanted to ensure that Canada remained a white man's country. The continuous passage law was nothing short of a weapon against non-European immigration. In 1914, Gurdeep Singh, a Sikh businessman, decided to challenge this law. He chartered a Japanese steamship, the Komagata Maru, from Hong Kong. On board were 376 passengers, mostly Sikhs, but also some Muslims and Hindus, all of whom were British subjects. They were legally entitled to travel within the empire. Gurdeep Singh believed they had the right to immigrate to Canada, which was a claim that was rooted in their status as British citizens. But when the Komagata Maru arrived in Vancouver on May 23, 1914, it wasn't met with open arms. Instead, the passengers were greeted by hostility and prejudice. A mob of angry locals gathered at the docks, calling the passengers Hindu invaders and shouting, "Drive the beggars back to the Ganges." The passengers were confined to the ship for 2 whole months, denied food, water, and legal help, as the Canadian authorities tried to force them to leave. What makes this story extraordinary is the resistance shown by the passengers and their allies. They refused to quietly accept this injustice. On board, the passengers staged a hunger strike, demanding their right to enter Canada. Gurdeep Singh and others used every legal tool available to challenge the government's actions. They hired a lawyer and argued their case in court, asserting that as British citizens, they had the same rights as any other subjects of the Crown. The passengers' fight was not just against a discriminatory immigration system, but also against the cultural norms of the time. These norms dictated that Canada should remain a predominantly white society. By refusing to accept these oppressive norms, the Komagata Maru passengers showed so much resistance, not just in a legal sense, but as a broader fight for dignity and equality. They also found many allies amongst the South Asian community in Vancouver, who raised money to support their legal fight and advocated on their behalf. This solidarity was an act of defiance in itself, pushing back against a system designed to divide and marginalize immigrant communities. Despite their efforts, the passengers were ultimately forced to leave. The ship was escorted out of Canadian waters by the military. But unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. When the Komagata Maru returned to India, British authorities accused the passengers of acting in defiance of the British Empire in Canada. At Budge Port near Calcutta, the ship was surrounded and 19 passengers were killed. Many others were imprisoned. This tragic ending shows a high cost of resistance, yet it also highlights its importance. The Komagata Maru incident matters because it exposes the deep roots of racism in Canada's history and the extraordinary efforts of marginalized communities to try to resist it. This resistance laid the groundwork for future movements that would challenge exclusionary laws and push for a more inclusive society. The Komagata Maru story is not just about exclusion, it's about the courage to fight back. It's about Gurdeep Singh, who once said, "If my story paves the way for repetition of any such single inequity being impossible on anyone in the future, I shall die in happiness to know that I had done my duty." His words remind us that resistance isn't just about winning, it's about refusing to accept injustice, even when the odds are stacked against you. The legacy of the Komagata Maru continues to resonate. It serves as a reminder of Canada's imperfect past and the need to continuously confront and challenge systemic racism. By studying moments like this, we can gain a deeper understanding of how resistance shapes a nation, not just in its policies, but also in its identity. Fast forward to present times. In 2016, the Canadian government finally formally issued an apology for the Komagata Maru incident. Over 100 years after the incident, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called it a stain on Canada's history. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode and our exploration of the Komagata Maru, a story of resilience, solidarity, and above all, resistance. Let it inspire us to keep fighting for a fairer and more inclusive Canada.